Good morning, everyone. I, Ramsha Hayat, Coordinator, Constitutional Law Society, Faculty of Law, Integral University, welcome you all to the second episode of our dialogue series, and today I am co hosting it with Saria Khan. The dialogue series was started by the Constitutional Law Society to allow an interaction between students and academicians on various contemporary law, politics, and policy issues to facilitate removing the skepticisms from the minds of the students and audience. The topic for today's discussion is Afghanistan crisis and its effect on South Asia. Recently, there has been a power transfer in Afghanistan that has completely changed the dynamics of the political sphere of the world, and especially of South Asian region. We, through this dialogue, aim to hold on discussion that what changes it will lead to in Afghanistan, what impact this power transfer will have on South Asian politics, and especially on India, as we have been a long-standing friend of Afghanistan. And we also want to explore this crisis through a vulnerability lens that what impact it will have on women and children of Afghanistan. To discuss and learn more about this issue today, we are honored to host Dr. Haroun Rahimi as the guest speaker for the second episode of the Constitutional Law Society's Dialogue series. Dr. Haroun Rahimi is an assistant professor of law at the American University of Afghanistan, Kabul, and a visiting scholar at UNIDROIT, Rome, where he is conducting research on role of intermediary countries in transplantation of European courts. He was also the Imam Bukhari Visiting Research Fellow at the University of Oxford. Dr. Rahimi completed his BA in law from Harith University, Afghanistan, and his LLM and PhD from University of Washington, United States of America. He is also a development consultant and a well-published author in the field of law and policy. We welcome you, sir, on the second episode of our dialogue series, and we believe your voice will benefit everyone in our society and to like-minded individuals who have joined us through the broadcast. Now, I request Dr. Rahimi to take us through the current situation of Afghanistan and what factors led to such situation and what he believes future holds for Afghanistan post this power transfer. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much for having me. And hello and a good day for everyone who's joining us. It is an honor to be here and talking to you and your audience. You pose very good questions. I will try to answer them the best I can. The first way we can approach this question is to ask, what are the constitutional views of Taliban? Like, what views do Taliban hold with regard to the fundamental questions of a state-society relationship? And you would be, one thing you would find in answering that question is how little information is available about what Taliban do believe about those fundamental questions. Taliban never adopted a constitution. While they were in power last time between 1996 and 2001, they drafted a constitution that was never adopted. And that constitution making process was not a very serious process for them. It was not a process through which fundamental questions of state and society were negotiated or addressed. And the way they approached that process in the 90s was to take an existing draft constitution, which had been developed by the Mujahideen political parties before the Taliban, and just change the political regime from a parliamentary system that the Mujahideen had agreed to an emirate. That's all they did. They fundamentally left the draft constitution unchanged, and they inserted they replaced the political regime from a parliamentary system to an emirate. That's all they did. And you could ask yourself why the emirate, how important the emirate is to the constitutional thoughts of Taliban. Again, I don't believe emirate presents a complete picture of a political regime. It had developed over time, emerged more than intellectually developed. It just emerged over time in a particular context. And the whole purpose of the emirate, what they call the political regime they had and they currently call it, the fundamental purpose of it, in my opinion, was originally to bring together, to provide a sense of unity to a fundamentally decentralized movement. Taliban over time have often had a very distributed operation. They often consist of units headed by certain individuals, so small units of fighters headed by an individual who are tied together, who are under leadership of a council, often a military council or some other sorts of council. And they've always acted semi-independently. And there was always a challenge of how you would bind these actors together, these relatively autonomous units together. And the way they solved that problem was to emphasize this position of Amir, which literally means commander in Arabic. But there's been a lot of stress on the obligation to obey the authority of the Amir. And in Taliban thoughts, there are different levels of amirs. I mean, there is an immediate amir, like immediate commander, and who would be the person who's heading the unit. And there would be an intermediate commander, the person who would command the lower commanders. And at the top, they imagined politically a supreme commander, Amir al-Mu'mineen, like the commander of faithful. And he would be the person to whom obedience was due as a matter of religion. And he would be the person who holds all the power in the emirate system. And that was, I think, how it came to be. It was more a matter of maintaining cohesion, maintaining unity in a decentralized system. That's, I think, why the emirate emerged as the political regime and why Taliban have always insisted on the emirate. In the draft constitution that they prepared, they kept, as I said, the Mujahideen draft, just replaced the parliamentary system, which would have been very divisive, for a decentralized movement, with the emirate. There's kind of, that's one aspect of the Taliban constitutional view you can think of, the issues of emirate for them. One more thing about the emirates, this idea of emirate, is that although the name and the title of the regime has remained the same, the position of the Amir, the supreme commander, has changed over time, not formally, but practically. Early on, until years ago, when Mullah Muhammad Omar, the founder of the movement, was alive, the position of Amir held a lot of power, de facto power. Mullah Omar, during the regime, the time in power, was very much involved in all appointments. He would command even forces, like would be in touch with the commanders. So he was very directly involved and would exercise real power in all aspects of the Taliban's last emirate in the 90s. However, since the insurgency began, the Taliban were toppled by the United States and they went through an insurgency phase. That the structure had to change. Mullah Omar had to be kind of kept away from public, well protected, even to the point that after he had died for a long period of time, even the senior members of the Taliban did not know that he had passed. So it just tells you that the position of the Amir could not have been that exercise that kind of direct power anymore. And the power had shifted to a number of councils, shuras, that were set up in Pakistan and later on towards the end in maybe other places, different places in Pakistan, in other places. And the power kind of diffused, became much more diffused within the movement. And also the fact that it was a military movement, the local commanders, the insurgency was primarily a military activities, local commanders also became powerful. After Mullah Omar death became public, the Taliban went through a process of fragmentation. There was few people, there was split. Two people claimed to be the emirs of the movement, but over time, very quickly, they reconstituted themselves as a new movement, which is headed by Mullah Hibbatullah, who's the current supreme leader of the movement. However, this time, this position of Amir does not hold the same kind of power practically as the position of the Amir held by Mullah Omar, although they did not make fundamental changes to their theory. I mean, whatever, if you could call it theory, just they don't admit that this is a different position of the Amir, or Amir holds different kind of power. They maintain that Amir still is the head of the movement, and by the virtue of the fact that they are the government now, they will be the head of the state as well. They still make that point, but fundamentally, Mullah Hibbatullah has much more limited power than Mullah Omar, the previous Amir, and the power is much more diffuse within the movement. There are different power holders who hold the power in the movement. Okay, so that is one fundamental aspect of Taliban constitutional thoughts. It's the idea of the emirate. It's meant to maintain cohesion in a decentralized movement. The position of Amir, the head of the emirate, has gone through a transformation over time, and the all-powerful Amir of Emirat of Mullah Omar has been transformed into a much more diffuse form of power within the emirate that Taliban actually have. That's one aspect of their political thought. The other aspect of their political thought is complete rejection of any form of representative governance, the complete rejection of anything, any form of elections. And it has multiple reasons to it. One reason is practical. As I said, it would have been very divisive for a decentralized movement to enter into those kind of parliamentary politics, and it would have challenged the cohesion of the political movement of the Taliban, which they actually valued greatly. Obedience and cohesion is a great value in the Taliban movement. They had to keep it that way because it was a de facto decentralized operation, a very distributed operation, and that has been the key, a key to the success during the Mujahideen era, when they were fighting the Mujahideen in the 90s. The other factions, one of their advantages was that they were able to remain a cohesive movement, whereas their opposition, the other Mujahideen parties, were actually engaging in fighting. So they saw from very on the value of cohesion and obedience to the ruler in the context of an emirate. But also during the insurgency as well, they were taking a lot of casualty. And they were operating as a distributed kind of movement, and it was very important for them to maintain that obedience to the ruler, the idea of obedience to the ruler and to the supreme leader, Amir, and at the same time maintain cohesion. So practically any form of representative government, the messiness of it and the formal distribution of power, which the positions would be available to outsiders in any conception of a representative government, would be a serious challenge to the cohesion of the Taliban. That's why they've rejected it practically. But they have rejected any form of representative governments normatively. Normatively meaning that they maintain that democracy or any other forms of elections has no precedent in Hanafi orthodoxy. Hanafi is a madhab, a school of law, a school of thought, basically within the Islamic jurisprudence. And Taliban are adherents of that school of thoughts, a school of jurisprudence, jurisprudential thoughts, and they have a very narrow understanding of Hanafi madhab, Hanafi school of thought. Fundamentally, they believe in the canonical texts, the texts that have become fundamental in Hanafi madhab, and they believe in orthodoxy in very kind of a exclusive and uncritical understanding of a number of fundamental texts that have reached canonical status during the pre-modern periods of Islamic thoughts. They believe what is Islamic is what is in those texts, and they believe that democratic governance does not have precedent in those texts and therefore is un-Islamic. So their understanding of what is Islamic, what would comply with the Islam, comes from that uncritical and exclusive those texts uncritically and exclusively, and those pre-modern Hanafi texts that have reached canonical status in pre-modern period. Obviously, that's a period of time where democracy was not really the dominant form of governance, and it's not surprising that those texts do not see democracy as a tenet of governance. But that's the position normatively, that because of the lack of precedent, it is un-Islamic, and they privilege in their thinking other forms that they believe were practiced in Islamic history as the true form of governance. And they believe the idea of emirate has historical backing in the Islamic context, even though, I mean, in Islamic history, many forms of governance were tried, many methods of selection of the head of community have been practiced, but Taliban obviously don't see it that way. So another tenet of their constitutional thoughts is the rejection of representative governance on practical and normative grounds. Also, practically, they defined their insurgency over the past 20 years against a democratic system. I mean, we can debate how democratic the past 20 years of Afghanistan history has been. Obviously, there were a lot of problems with elections. There was a lot of authoritarianism on the part of the two powerful presidents of Afghanistan, the last two presidents. But still, it was a norm. I mean, it claimed to be a democratic order, and Taliban defined their insurgency against that. That also plays into their opposition to democracy. Okay, that is the another important aspect of their constitutional thoughts. There's rejection of representative governance. So that is what we kind of know about Taliban so far. They took over Afghanistan not a long time ago, in August, and so far they haven't made any announcement. They haven't made any statement about how they wish to govern Afghanistan. What are their stance on different issues? They've announced the caretaker government, but no statement about the structure of the state beyond saying that their state is going to be an emirate. So they basically say that they would they have reimposed or reestablished their emirate. But institutionally, what does this mean for the which body is going to have the legislative power, which body is going to have the executive power, how the power, how the even disputes going to be resolved based on what laws? Those are all open questions. We really don't know the answer to. The government they've announced, the caretaker government, just is names of different people who will be heading different public portfolios in the government, different ministries in the government. They have not made any announcement about the judiciary, like who is going to be the head of the judiciary, what the structure the judiciary will have. And they have made no announcement about the legislative branch of the state, like how legislation is going to take place in the new emirate the Taliban have established. In practice, over the past month they've been in power, they have enacted quote unquote laws. They call them qanun, but they have come from different authorities. Ministry of Interior has enacted rules about demonstrations, has claimed to have enacted rules about demonstrations. Ministry of Information and Culture have claimed that they have enacted rules about public broadcasting and such. So it seems like the people in charge of different parts of the government are engaging in rulemaking as well. And it's not very clear yet what the structure fundamentally the Taliban state is going to take, how much is going to be similar with the way they operated as an insurgency, or how much similar it's going to be to the way they were operating as a state during the last time they were in power. And I will just briefly talk about their conception of law as the last point. Taliban maintain that their law is going to be Hanafi fiqh. As I said, the Hanafi school of jurisprudence and those texts that have reached canonical status, they believe that is going to be the law for Taliban. And they believe that they are basing all their actions on Hanafi fiqh. And they often reject human legislation as un-Islamic, as something that should not be allowed, as something that is foreign and should be rejected. In practice, as you can imagine, it's impossible to govern a modern nation state based on just pre-modern texts. And even the last time they were in power, shortly, they did not change all the laws of the countries. Many areas of law remained unchanged. Many codes and statutes remained unchanged in the 90s when they took over. And they actually enacted some codes and statutes in the fashion of a modern state. I mean, Afghanistan's, for example, citizenship code was enacted during the Taliban last period of power. So even though they maintain that all laws are going to be Hanafi fiqh, in practice, they have incorporated elements of modern legislations in the past, and not yet. As I said, currently, we've seen some rules coming from different ministries, but that's it. And even within the Hanafi fiqh, as I said, Hanafi fiqh cannot be, Hanafi fiqh is just the way they understand it is a number of pre-modern texts that have reached canonical status. Canonical status means just like they're become highly authoritative within the Hanafi fiqh. But you have to realize that Hanafi fiqh has never been the law of a state. The law of a state meaning there's been no nation state that have systematically sought to implement the Hanafi fiqh. It's often taught in seminaries, in religious schools, and without being burdened with the responsibilities of governing a state. I mean, in Pakistan, a state is basically a British parliamentary system, and they have modern legislations. If you take Pakistan as an example where Hanafi fiqh is influential, even historically, the Ottoman Empire had the Hanafi fiqh as their basis of their legal system. Even Ottoman Empire had to codify Hanafi fiqh. They tried to codify the Hanafi fiqh. That's where Majalla comes from. But also beyond that, they had ordinances. The Ottomans had ordinances that were often based on the Western codes of law. And even with the caveat that Ottoman Empire was not a nation state, they were still operating in a context where a state had much fewer responsibilities and the operation of the state was much simpler. So even though Taliban claim that their law is Hanafi fiqh, practically that cannot be. They are in need of legislations, and in the past they have accepted modern legislations, and that's one side of it. The other side of it, there's really no way to systematically implement Hanafi fiqh as a nation state. No one has. The pre-modern texts of Hanafi fiqh do not provide enough sufficient solutions to the problem of a nation state. Even though Taliban, with their movement, they privilege certain texts in Hanafi fiqh that have to do with governance, with the issues of governance. For example, Fatawi, there are collections of Fatawi from the Indian Mughal Empire, where a time where there was this empire in India, as you know, Islamic empire, meaning that the Mughal were trying to implement religion in their realm, and there were certain books of fatwas, opinions, that were compiled under different Mughal rulers, and those fatwas often have to do with the issues of governance, and Taliban actually do sometimes privilege them, and those fatwas are also from Hanafi fiqh. But even with that, you can imagine that the context is so different that it would be almost impossible to systematically implement Hanafi fiqh in any shape or form in a context of nation state. And that's why their approach to Hanafi fiqh becomes very much unsystematic, and it becomes very fragmented. And often they fill in the gaps with their own perceptions of their own cultural understanding of what the society should look like, their own assumptions about what the role of women in society should be, for example, and also some elements of modern legislation. There are places they deviate from Hanafi fiqh. For example, Hanafi fiqh allows for women to be judges almost in all matters except for the issues of hudud and qasas. These is kind of capital punishments category of crimes. Other than that, women can be judges in all cases. During the Taliban last regime, women were not allowed to work, and let alone being judged. They had never had any woman judge, even though it would be completely acceptable under Hanafi fiqh. So that just tells you how much their own cultural, how much Taliban's own views on role of women in society plays a role, even when the Hanafi fiqh is permissible with regard to women role in judiciary. And also, the Taliban have set prices in the past during the insurgency as a way to obtain acceptance with the population, or as a way to manage the society. They've set prices for different goods. Hanafi fiqh generally does not allow price setting to take place. So, I mean, there are many examples you can go through and see how they deviate for practical reasons from Hanafi fiqh, often because of the representation, their understanding of role of women in societies, or under some cultural lens they're bringing in, cultural views they're bringing in as a core of their movement, as what they believe the Afghan society should look like. And some other times because of the demands of their insurgency, because they were insurgency for 20 years, or demands of governance. So I will stop here. It was just a little bit of thoughts on the Taliban's conception of law. I mean, how they think about the issues of law. I've talked a little bit about their political regime, the emirate, and what it means. And I'm looking forward to answer your questions, any questions you may have about those topics and more. Thank you.
Your permission, I would like to start the dialogical discourse, which will be conducted by me and Saria. Coming on to our very first question of today's session, it is well known to all of us that the current situation of Afghanistan is likely to produce a sudden and dramatic change in the South Asian politics. Could you elaborate how it is going to affect South Asian countries? Also, do you believe that the border conflicts with Pakistan and China might as well play key roles in Afghanistan's future?
So, I mean, in terms of constitutional politics, if you're thinking about constitutional politics, it's unlikely to have any impact beyond Afghanistan. Pakistan, as I said, like a country closest ally to the Taliban historically and practically, they are basically a parliamentary, a British parliamentary political system, and I don't see that having an impact on a constitutional level, like on constitutional politics. There are different ways that what happened in Afghanistan could affect South Asian context. One is this idea and the emboldening of different constituencies in South Asian context, especially in Pakistan, who hold views similar to the Taliban. There have been a recent example in the Lal Masjid, as I don't know if you may follow the news, where clerics had raised the Taliban flag on top of the masjid, and the Pakistani government tried to interfere and take the flag down, and they kind of entered into standoff with these clerics whose views are very much aligned with the Taliban. And if you remember from recent history, the attempt to kind of calm a previous similar clash between the people in the Lal Masjid and the Pakistani government led to the creation of the Taliban, Pakistani Taliban. So just one example of how what happened in Afghanistan is emboldening certain constituencies at least in Pakistan, who share the ideals of the Taliban. And now they see themselves emboldened with what happened in Afghanistan, and they may take more aggressive stance and challenge the respective government more. That's one possible kind of spillover from this. There's also the issue of terrorism, and there are extremist groups who are active in Afghanistan, and they have different relationship with the Taliban. There is Daesh of Khorasan. They have a very hostile relationship with the Taliban. They are fighting the Taliban, but there are other Taliban are fighting them. But there are other terrorist groups who have different relationship with the Taliban, like Taliban of Pakistan, like the Pakistani Taliban have good relationship with the Afghan Taliban. They have hosted them. They have very good relationships. The Al-Qaeda, the United Nations Security Council, and many other observers believe that there is still a relationship going on, and Taliban have just not taken aggressive actions against the Al-Qaeda and their remittance in Afghanistan, the remaining elements of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, despite their agreement with the United States. So, I mean, the other aspect is also anti-Indian terrorist groups in Afghanistan, the Taliban and Sahaba and others who have some presence in Afghanistan, not very major, but they have some presence in Afghanistan. And the Taliban being in power could allow them to operate in Afghanistan maybe better than they could under the previous government. There are anti-Chinese elements, terrorist groups. There are anti-Central Asian terrorist groups. So, I mean, you could talk about what Taliban in being in power means for those terrorist groups. And obviously, some of those terrorist groups have regional agendas. And so they are after targeting Asia. So, I mean, South Asia. So you could think about how Taliban take over would change that terrorist kind of landscape. And all signs point to the change would be negative. It would become knowing what we know of Taliban so far, it seems like this change not only going to psychologically embolden those groups because they see this as a victory against the West, the United States, and they share many of the elements of ideology with Taliban. So there's going to be a psychological boost. They're going to be electrified with all of this, but also there's going to be possibly a logistical and actual infrastructural positive change happening with the Taliban in power, at least with regard to certain groups, not all of them. Certainly ISIS-K may be targeted, Daesh may be targeted, but some other groups may be helped. And so, I mean, those are the two possible kind of spillover from Afghanistan, the emboldenment of those constituencies in South Asia that may share views with the Taliban. They may be emboldened to challenge their respective government. And also there could be, with regard to certain terrorist groups, this could be provide a robust infrastructure. Afghanistan could provide a robust infrastructure or support for their continued operation with the Taliban in power.
Thank you, sir, for throwing a light on the political upheaval this crisis is going to bring in South Asian countries. Moving on to our next question. In June, the Wall Street Journal reported that US intelligence officials have stated the Afghan government could fall within 6 months to a year after the US troop withdrawal. And that happened in just 5 days. Taliban entered Kabul and President Ashraf Ghani fled the country. If it was known to happen, could it be possible that US could have prevented the same from happening by staying back in Afghanistan?
I mean, so the United States had made a deal with the Taliban. It was negotiated over a year and was signed in February of 2020. And the purpose of the deal was, the essence of the deal was that the Taliban would refrain from attacking the United States and international forces, and would commit to not allowing Afghanistan soil to be used against the United States and its allies' interests. And in exchange, the United States would withdraw its troops. So that means for a period of since February of 2020 until the completion of U.S. troops withdrawal, which was supposed to first be completed in May, but it was extended by President Biden after he won the election by a few months, and the new deadline was set for September 11. So that was part of the deal they made. And you could argue that the reason the United States was not attacked, it was clear that the reason the United States was not attacked, they had low casualty, and in Afghanistan, almost zero casualty for that period of time, was because Taliban had decided not to attack, has agreed not to attack the U.S. targets, the American targets. But the deal said nothing about the Taliban's attacking Afghan government. It allowed the Taliban to focus all their efforts in attacking, fighting the Afghan national security forces, and also conducting a campaign of terror against the elements of the post-2001 order, civil rights activists, women rights activists, judges, women judges, and many others were targeted during that period of time. And many observers believe that those attacks were linked to the Taliban. So that piece, that so-called peace agreement. That agreement allowed the Taliban to focus their attempts on Afghan government forces, and at the same time, the U.S. had agreed to, as a part of their withdrawal, they were basically reducing support for the Afghan National Security Forces because they were in the process of evacuation, of the withdrawal of their forces. So if you think about it from the military perspective, Afghan National Security Forces had less and less foreign support, and were facing a fight, a more emboldened Taliban, and also more focused Taliban. Now that the Taliban did not have to worry about being targeted by the Americans or international forces, that obviously changed the battlefield dynamic. And if you could imagine that the U.S. would have made some other decision, for example, they would have decided not to negotiate with the Taliban, or they would have decided to stay in Afghanistan longer, obviously that would have an impact on the battlefield. But also that would have meant that the United States might have had to bring in more forces, because then they would have been actively fighting the Taliban. Whereas with the deal, they had the luxury of not being attacked by the Taliban, so they did not have to fight. So it was not in no way it was a sustainable. The posture they had towards the end was not a sustainable posture. It was. It had to be either ramped up or continue the process of drawdown that they did. I mean, you can debate, all the choices they made throughout the past 20 years, and even towards the end, how the deal that was negotiated emboldened the Taliban, how it made Afghanistan government much more vulnerable politically and also militarily, and how just because of the pace of withdrawal, how some logistical support that was provided by the U.S. forces and the U.S. contractors were not negotiated for. It was not clear who's going to kind of take over for those critical support that the Afghan National Security Forces needed to fight the Taliban. Because of the pace of the withdrawal, there was not enough preparation made about those issues. And you could debate all those possible kind of alternative choices that could have been made and postulate the alternative outcomes. But I think that's not a reasonable exercise to do. There would have been a different outcome had the United States made different choices. But I really cannot speculate further than that, because it was a very complicated process that started for more than a year. There were a lot of pieces to it. Afghan government obviously played a major role. They were for until a very long time, many reports show that they were hopeful that the U.S. would change its mind. Basically, what you suggested, that the U.S. would not follow through with the deal, especially with the U.S. elections, President Biden, and it seemed like they were unprepared. They were not preparing enough politically. The President Ghani, the former president of Afghanistan, did not do what it took to form a coalition, a domestic coalition politically against the Taliban. And he insisted on his own divisive politics, the party that was dividing the anti-Taliban camp, partly because he underappreciated the Taliban threat, and partly because he still believed that the U.S. support would continue, and military support would continue beyond even what the Americans said they would be willing to do. And also, even just in terms of logistics and military kind of preparedness, it seems like there was not early on. When the U.S. counterpart started telling the Afghans, both sides, that they are going to withdraw their troops, that statement was not perceived. That was not believed by the leadership of Afghan government, so they were not well prepared. Obviously, the widespread corruption in the last government prevent them from being an effective government in terms of fighting the Taliban, logistics of the war, and such, but also it undermined the legitimacy of the Afghan government in the eyes of the populace, in the eyes of the people, which made it weakened or lessened the support they would have otherwise had if the corruption had been more seriously dealt with before it all came to this.
Thank you, sir. Talking more about US, recently President Joe Biden claimed that Al-Qaeda is gone and they have accomplished their mission in Afghanistan, but UN intelligence suggests contrary. Does this suggest that there is any hint of Taliban Al-Qaeda relationship thriving in Afghanistan? And if so, what effect it will have on South Asian countries as well as US?
As you pointed out, the United States had basically redefined. I mean, it's United States has been in Afghanistan for for almost 20 years, and at different times they had different stories about the war. I mean, about why we're there. Originally, I mean, it was sometimes it was a counter-terrorism, meaning they were just there to kill, to destroy Al-Qaeda or other terrorist groups. At times it was counter-insurgency, meaning they wanted to not only kill Al-Qaeda and destroy Al-Qaeda, they wanted to also create an effective government in Afghanistan that would prevent any terrorist group from re-emerging. Right, that was counter-insurgency. At times it was nation building. They were talking like we want to make Afghanistan into a democracy, and it's about women's rights and such. So over 20 years, US had different, at least stated publicly, different objectives and made told different stories about the war in Afghanistan. But towards the end, Biden basically said that we always had very narrow goals in Afghanistan, and it was just basically destroying Al-Qaeda. And the United States claims that Al-Qaeda has been destroyed to the point of being irrelevant or posing no threat to the US homeland, at least for a period of time. They admit that Al-Qaeda can re-emerge in Afghanistan in matters of, I mean, it's a matter of debate of how long it's going to take, but they admit that it can re-emerge. But they believe that they have enough capability, what they call over-the-horizon capability, meaning without having US troops in Afghanistan from some other posts in the region or beyond, they have the capability to target Al-Qaeda kind of operations in the region and in Afghanistan if they do re-emerge. But at the moment, they believe it's not. They are not a serious threat to the United States, and that's one of their rationale for the withdrawal. That is one of the reasons they withdrew troops from Afghanistan. How accurate that assessment is, that's an open question. I'm not a counterterrorism expert, but there are many experts. Esfandiar Mir is an expert at Stanford who observes the situation and monitors the situation, and he believes that the United States government is underestimating the Al-Qaeda risk, and that obviously Al-Qaeda is a serious threat for the world and the region. With regard to the Taliban relationship with Al-Qaeda, I mean, the United Nations Security Council, even the United States itself, observed that there is still relationship between Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Taliban themselves have kind of walked back their commitments with regard to Al-Qaeda. They have maintained publicly that they have no obligation to cut ties with Al-Qaeda, like aggressively go after Al-Qaeda operatives in Afghanistan or in the region, in Afghanistan where they are. But they understand their obligation very narrowly. They're saying that their obligation is not to allow Afghan soil to be used against, to plan and execute an attack against any other country. So they're basically saying even if they're Al-Qaeda member active in Afghanistan, present in Afghanistan, that is not a violation of our obligations, as long as they're not using our Afghanistan soil to plan or execute an attack against the foreign target. But you can imagine, I mean, how difficult it would. I mean, if the attack does occur, it would be very hard to connect that attack to Afghanistan and claim that it was planned and executed in Afghanistan, even if it was planned and executed from Afghanistan, just because of the fact that obviously these operations are very opaque. And Taliban would have kind of plausible deniability, even if attack occurs, would have plausible deniability, could claim that the attack was not planned or executed from Afghanistan. You have to keep in mind that Taliban is still maintain that Al-Qaeda was not behind 9/11. They still maintain publicly that Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda were not behind 9/11. They don't concede even that much still. So it tells you that if they understand their obligation with regard to Al-Qaeda, just not to allow Afghan souls to be used for planning an attack or executing an attack, if that's their minimum, their understanding, and they don't understand their obligation to include going after Al-Qaeda members, arresting them, maybe extraditing to other countries, or just basically aggressively fighting them, they don't see their obligation as such. They see their obligation as just not using Afghan soils for planning and execution of an attack. If even an attack does occur, it just means that the Al-Qaeda are likely to have a free reign in Afghanistan to resurge. I mean, basically rebuild their operation right now in a space that is controlled by their friendly force, Taliban, and with no U.S. or international presence. I mean, the monitoring over the horizon is going to be more limited compared to the underground troops, obviously. So they will have a kind of a conducive environment for them to recope and recuperate and just try to restart their operation. And even at some point, if they do plan or execute an attack, then Taliban are likely to have plausible deniability and saying that they have held to their obligations not to allow Afghanistan to be used for planning an attack, just because it's going to be informationally complex, like in terms of intelligence perspective, it's going to be a complex issue. So this is not good news for anyone, and that's one of the biggest concerns that the world has about the Taliban's re-emergence to power, like rise to power. And I mean, the world is primarily concerned about counterterrorism. Region in particular are concerned about counterterrorism. Even though Afghans have a more comprehensive view, Afghans are worried about their rights, basic rights that they may not enjoy under Taliban, especially the Afghan women and other minority groups, but also economy. Afghanistan economy was completely dependent on foreign aid, and now with the Taliban in power, the Afghan economy will not receive this kind of support it received internationally, and that means that's a very bad news for the Afghan economy, and that is unfolding right now. The poverty is rising, the food scarcity is rising. The medical sector is failing because it's dependent on foreign aid. So I mean, Afghans have obviously many more concerns with the Taliban being in power, but the world has primarily counterterrorism concerns. I mean, they're both connected. I mean, Taliban's if they don't aggressively fight and they don't aggressively go after terrorist groups, they are unlikely to receive international recognition, and that is obviously tied to their access to the Afghan funds. That is critical for the Afghanistan economy to actually be saved a little bit, and it would be also important for the Taliban to receive international recognition, so Afghanistan can actually receive aid and loan and investment like any other normal country. So I mean, economy is not completely separate from counterterrorism, but Afghans would care more about the economy, but the world and the region is much more concerned about the counterterrorism.
Thank you, sir. Now, coming on to the South Asian country, which has been a long-standing friend of Afghanistan, that is India. Can you please elaborate what effect the power transfer will have on India-Afghanistan relationship?
I mean, as you said, and as you pointed out, India has been a close ally to the previous, I mean, the post-2001 political regime in Afghanistan. That means that India has been opposed. I mean, has been opposed to the Taliban, have been a main a main strategic partner to the Afghan government in their fight against Taliban. So this means that India does not have the same good relationship with the Taliban that many other countries in the region may have. Many countries, including Iran, Central Asian countries, have started maintaining good relationship with the Taliban even before, I mean, long before this happened, long before the overtake of Kabul happened by the Taliban. So India is at a disadvantage just because they don't have the same relationship, and they were the main strategic backer of one of the main strategic backer of the Afghanistan governments against the Taliban. So they are at a disadvantage. And as I said, there are anti-Indian terrorist groups active in Afghanistan in parts of the countries. Although their presence is not major, but they are there, and India may have concerns about their activities and possibly they using the Afghanistan territory against the Indian interest in the region and just targeting even India. I mean, in the past, the terrorist groups have targeted India, terrorist groups that had their links with Pakistan, and now there is another friendly government, quote unquote, potentially friendly government, we don't know much, in Afghanistan that could empower those terrorist groups. And politically, India is at a disadvantage because they don't have the same good relationship or the same working relationship with the Taliban that many other countries do have as a way to safeguard their counterterrorism interests. Taliban have have said that they would like India to continue their economic activities and investments in Afghanistan. But the close relationship with Pakistan is going to complicate that possibility. And I really don't know what the future holds for the future of Afghanistan and Pakistan relationship. Afghanistan and Indian relationship, which is going to be overshadowed with the Afghanistan-Pakistan issues. More recently, Prime Minister of India in the Shanghai summit, the Shanghai summit, stated that the extremism is the major issue, is a major threat to the security of the region, and at least India believes it to be. And they raised concerns, and Modi raised concerns about this rise of Taliban to power may embolden the terrorists, the extremists, and that is a threat that is what is common to the region. And this Taliban rise to power may embolden the extremist groups and be a boost to extremism in the whole region. And India sees it as a major threat to the Indian interest and India. But what tools does India have at this point to counter that threat, especially with regard to Afghanistan? India has tried to reach out relatively late relative to other countries and tried to establish a working relationship with Taliban to work on issues of counterterrorism primarily. I don't know how successful those relationships have been. They are mostly behind closed door. But given the close ties of Afghan Taliban with the Pakistani establishment, it is unlikely that a good relationship would emerge, even though Taliban have tried to maintain their autonomy from the Pakistan establishment. They have said that they would like a good relationship with all countries, including India. But it is going to be an incredibly challenging relationship to manage, but also incredibly crucial because Taliban are the de facto government of Afghanistan. They control the territory, and they are going to be the only partner basically in counterterrorism activities in Afghanistan that any countries, including India, have to work with. So I hope. I think India does understand this, and they need to have working relationship with Taliban to work with them. I hope that India continues to work on the issue of economy and investment to help ordinary Afghans who have been recipients of the investments and good work that India has done in Afghanistan. And I hope that India could continue to have good relationship with the Afghan people and continue its humanitarian work, its economic work, at the same time maintain good working relationship with the Taliban to allow the humanitarian and economic work to continue, but at the same time have the channels in place to address, at least pressure Taliban talk and engage with Taliban to address its counterterrorism concerns. How practical that will be, I think it's going to be partly up to the Taliban and how autonomous Taliban can be from the Pakistan establishment. And they've said that they would like to have a relationship with everyone, and they don't. They have a level of autonomy from Pakistani establishment. I don't believe that they are. Pakistan does have influence on Taliban, but it's not unlimited, and it's not. It's a matter of debate of how much influence Pakistan has, but it is going to be a major challenge in Afghan and Indian relationship moving forward.
Thank you for bringing it in such a clear and concise manner. Coming on to governance of Afghanistan, in your article on Al Jazeera, you stated that there is no single and absolute reading of Islamic law that can guide an Islamic state, and Taliban may be getting wrong about Islamic governance. Could you please explain these statements for our scholars and audience?
Absolutely. As I said, in the Taliban's idea, their formal position is that their laws is Hanafi fiqh. And the way they understand Hanafi fiqh is, as I said, through this a number of texts, influential texts that have reached a high level of kind of established status in pre-modern context. And they're basically saying that to them, Islam, like what is Islamic and what is compliant with Islam and what's against Islam, is going to be understood from that lens exclusively, meaning they don't want to consider all the new kind of the continuation of debates in fiqh about many issues like role of women. I mean, the way that Muslim jurists have grappled with the questions of modernity, women rights, the political systems and such beyond the pre-modern time. I mean, all the intellectual discourse that have occurred, all the opinions that have emerged since the canonical text of Hanafi fiqh, the Taliban hold to that position, to kind of that status, they reject all of those, and they don't see them even as relevant. And I was pointing out that it's a very problematic understanding of fiqh. It's a very problematic understanding of Islamic jurisprudence, because Islamic jurisprudence inherently is a discourse. It's a pluralistic discourse, and it consists of bodies of opinions. I mean, the variety of opinions, and it's an ongoing discourse, it's a process. It's not a fixed text or fixed rules, and there are a range of opinions. And also the Islamic, jurisprudence, the fiqh, is primarily about how Muslims should live their lives. It's not primarily about what a state should do. It's not about what rules a state should use violence to enforce. There are two questions. Like, one question is how a Muslim should live their lives to please Allah and obtain salvation. The other question is what rules should a state in a Muslim society you enforce through violence, right? Through state-sanctioned violence. And those are not the same questions. And Islamic jurisprudence, fiqh, is primarily concerned with the first question of Muslims' life. There is overlap. There are areas where a state should intervene, and we can debate how a state intervention should relate to this Islamic discourse, to the bodies of opinion that exist about that particular issue in a particular time. And we can debate how state intervention should relate to those discourse, to those debates, to this process of elaboration and kind of open-ended elaboration on questions of how Muslims should live their lives. And I believe that the choices to which opinion to follow, which position the state, not the Muslim as a matter of with their own freedom, but the state as a collective entity that holds the monopoly of violence, like which positions of the many positions that exist, of the plurality of opinion that exists in Islam, which position should the state choose to enforce with regard to a matter that the state should intervene, because a state should not intervene in everything. All aspects of human lives are relevant to the fiqh discourse, because all aspects of life are relevant if you want to live a moral life. I mean, there is a moral demand on all aspects of life, but a state should not intervene in all aspects of life. That would be totalitarianism. That is a totalitarian state that concerns every aspect of human life as a legitimate domain of interference. So the state should not intervene in all aspects, but there are aspects that the state should intervene, and we can debate how that intervention should relate to the bodies of opinion that exist. And I think that choice of which opinion should be the basis of a state intervention, how a state intervention should relate to the discourse of jurisprudence, is a political choice. Basically, it's a choice made not jurisprudentially. There's no one answer, and those political choices should be made in a way that is accountable to. Should be made by those and through processes and institutions that are accountable to the population, because that's the only legitimate way to do it. Because there's really no one can say that it is Sharia or Islam the end of the debate. When you just say we're gonna conduct a statecraft, like a state matters of conduct the affairs of the state in accordance with Islam, it raises the question of, okay, how are we going to understand Islam? How and when a state should actually intervene, when it should not intervene, and all those choices are inherently political choices. These are the choices that don't have one answer. They are choices that have a lot of answers. And the only legitimate way that those choices could be made is through a process where the people who are affected by those choices, the public, the Muslims, get to have a voice in terms of how their state in this Muslim majority countries should operate. And I think that fundamentally is a recipe for a representative government, a form of government where choices are made about those issues in a collective matters, in a way that different voices are heard, and ultimately the people who make those choices are held accountable to the public that is affected by those choices.
Thank you, sir, for explaining your writings to our scholars. Also, there has been a generational change in the Taliban leadership. And does this indicate any possibility of a less hardline regime than 1996 to 2001? Alternatively, have they learned more about politics, negotiation, and diplomacy during that time?
Absolutely. I mean, with regard to your second point, absolutely. Taliban have become much more adept to international politics, and they've proven that with the way they handled the negotiation with the United States, and they've handled their relationship with many countries in the region. During the time they were given, the chance they were given to conduct basically diplomacy from their Doha office, the office that was created to conduct the negotiations around the U.S. troops withdrawal. So they've shown a lot more sophistication in terms of being able to conduct foreign policy. They've also shown a lot more sophistication in conducting basically public relations. They run multiple websites. They've had social media campaigns during their insurgency, using different platforms to get their message out, to engage basically in a psychological warfare against their enemies, the Afghan government at the time. So on those fronts, absolutely, there have been changes. And also the generational change is true. Afghanistan is fundamentally a very young country, like 60-70% of the population is below 30, so very incredibly young, and Taliban are no exceptions. They are very young. That means most of Taliban's fighters were never alive during the last Taliban government of the 90s. Most of them were born, raised, grew up during the insurgency phase, and all they know is this the insurgency and how it ended with them in power. That's all they know. Even though the top leadership of the movement is often old guards. I mean, if you look at the caretaker government, they announced the people in charge, Mullah Baradar and the Akhund, who's the head of the prime minister, and many members of the cabinet are the old timers. Many members of the Doha office that conducted the negotiation with the United States were old timers, meaning they were they were made integral part of their last regime. So the intergenerational dynamic is there. But what does it mean? What does that intergenerational dynamic mean? Actually, the observers are pointing to the fact that the younger generation of Taliban are actually much more hardliners. They are much more ideologically motivated. They have much deeper connections with the international jihadist network. And they often are much more uncompromising and much less practical and pragmatic compared to the old guards who had the experience of overseeing a failed government because of their rigid ideological positions, right? So, I mean, the Mullah Baradar, for example, remembers how it was to run a government as an international pariah. Mullah Akhund, who's the prime minister of the Taliban right now, basically the head of the government, remembers. I mean, he was the foreign minister very briefly. He was the governor of Kandahar, and he held many high positions during the last Taliban emirate in Afghanistan. And remembers, I mean, I imagine he understands how hard it is to be a government without funding, without international support. So, I mean, they often, many observers point out that they tend to be the old guards tend to be the more pragmatic and more flexible, leaning within the Taliban. And the new generation, the young generation of the Taliban, who engage in this brutal insurgency and often have more ties with the jihadist movements and are much more ideologically uncompromising, tend to present the hardliners within the movement. And the Taliban as a movement, as I said, always have valued unity and cohesion. That means they are beholden to the opinion of their fighters in rank, these young fighters of the Taliban. They cannot alienate them. They are very much beholden to their views, and that's one of the reasons they cannot. Cannot, even if the old guards would like to, they cannot moderate their stance on many issues. They cannot balance different objectives. They cannot take positions like on issues of women's and democracy and many other international policies. They would have a hard time holding positions that would alienate or would not be well received by the files and ranks, who are often hold much more extreme views and much more ideologically they are much more ideologically inflexible and rigid when it comes to many issues. So the inflexibility in the movement, or the being more ideologically more uncompromising as a movement, which is bad news for those who hope the Taliban could moderate their stance, they could balance different objectives, and could expand their reach and become more inclusive, is driven, actually, those dynamics are driven by the young Talibans, who are much more indoctrinated ideologically, who have no experience of actually being the government, and are very much emboldened by their victory and see this as basically a validation of their cause. And they are basically having the position that we won as a Taliban and will govern as a Taliban. This obviously misses the point that being an insurgency is very different than being a government, and running an insurgency and being successful as an insurgency, which basically means being able to cause a state to collapse, is not the same as being able to govern and look over an economy, like look after an economy and participate in international politics. They're not the same things, but that's not how it's understood within the movement. It's understood that, this victory is a validation of everything we've all long believed, and now that we are in power, we're going to continue with the same kind of approach, and we're not going to change. We won as a Taliban, we'll continue govern as a Taliban, but it's obviously not conducive to good governance, to more inclusivity in the governments, and it's not very helpful in Taliban's ability to secure international recognition and international support, which they badly need to just save the economy, if nothing else. You have technical issues. But generally, while as tries to connect, generally Taliban have within the Taliban, I think, the talks of infighting is exaggerated often. The core ideological views of the Taliban, all factions in the Taliban are actually in common. They're not an ideologically diverse movement. There are variations and leanings on questions of how much should they do to please international community, like for international appeasement, how gradual their implementation of their ideas should be, and for example, there and techniques of how heavy-handed they should be in dealing with the population and such. There are debates, there are disagreements around those lines, but fundamentally, the basic ideology of the movement is actually common to most. I think is not an ideologically complex movement, ideologically diverse movement, but there are disagreements and variations on matters of how much international appeasement should be done, what kind of relationship they should have with foreign fighters, and how gradual they should implement their ideas in Afghanistan, and how they should be dealing with the population. How aggressively they should be dealing with population. Those issues are subject to disagreement, but fundamentally the values of the movements are common. So they're not very diverse. They share all of those values, the leadership as well as file and rank.
Thank you, sir. Now, as we have to look at this power transfer through a vulnerability lens, our next question is focused on women's rights and its comparison to 2001 Afghan rule. So, Taliban imposed a strict law and women rights during its last rule from 1996 to 2001 were compromised. But this time they have shown a new moderate face and promised women's rights within the boundaries of Islamic law. So will this change anything in comparison to 1996-2001 rule, or is it going to remain same?
I think fundamentally their views on women's role in society, the views of at least the final rank, the views of the ordinary Taliban fighters have not changed on issues of women's right positions in society. I don't think that's changed fundamentally, but they have shown willingness to be more pragmatic, more flexible in implementing those views, given that Afghanistan has changed so much. The last time they came in power to kind of they took over a society that was completely destroyed, had gone through a period of civil war, a very devastating civil war. This time they are taking over in Afghanistan is much more. It's kind of completely different. Afghans, women have different expectations of their roles in society. So Taliban, I think, even though their views haven't fundamentally changed, they have shown some acknowledgement that they are governing a different Afghanistan, and they may have to be patient. They have to make kind of adjustments to at least their practical policies on issues of women to accommodate, to a certain extent, this changed reality of Afghanistan. I think that's how I understand it. Not a fundamental change in fundamental views of the Taliban. It's a change in Afghan society and Taliban appreciating that they have to be they have to maybe rethink the implementation of some of their fundamental policies in light of a changed Afghanistan. That's how I see it. So how they have done so far, there have been a mixed image. Taliban, for example, have said that they would not allow women in leadership role, and they announced a caretaker government that has no women in it. So that is continuity with the past regime. However, they said that the women are allowed to work in the government in different sectors, private and public, not in leadership roles, but in other roles. So that is a change. However, those promises are not materialized yet. Women in many sectors are not allowed to resume work yet. They said that it's going to take time for Taliban government have said that it's going to take time for them to come up with the rules and guidelines for women working in public. And they've all often said that now that they are the government, some of their fighters who are going to be in government offices may need more time to adjust these co-ed environments, maybe need more time to adjust in working with women. And they said, that's going to take time. And therefore, they are basically postponing they're not denying the women rights to work in public offices lower than leadership roles, but they're postponing it to some of those practical problems being sorted out. It's not a very promising, obviously, development, but it is different than the position they held in the 1990s. In the 1990s, which basically they denied the woman role in public life entirely. So there is a kind of a slightly modified in terms of at least implementation on that front. In certain sectors, for example, health sector, out of the basic necessity, they have allowed women to continue their work practically. But other sectors, they have made promises that they would be able to work under certain rules that are yet to be developed and adopted, and so far told women to stay home. And they said even they were going to pay your salaries, those who are government employees, but they should not come back to work yet. So that's one aspect. With regard to education, the elementary schools, like girls and boys, are allowed to go back to school. In Afghanistan, schools have resumed. But beyond that, for secondary education, middle school and high schools, 2 days ago, they announced that boys' school is going to reopen and has reopened, but the girls' schools are not reopened yet. The announcement said nothing about the resumption of girls' schools. But later on, when they were pressed on this issue, the spokesperson for the Taliban, Zabiullah Mujahid, said that they have all the intentions of reopening girls' schools, but they are trying to figure out the practicality of it. Basically, how to completely separate women and girls and basically females and males and in all education spaces. they're working on a plan to do it, and we really don't know what that plan is, and they're still working on it. It's not really reassuring, because last time they were in power, they basically had a similar logic, basically saying that women can continue education, but the conditions were not conducive for women's education at the time. They're hinting the same thing, although this time they're saying no, they're going to come up with the rules for women's education very soon, and women will be the girls' secondary education will resume soon as well. So how soon, we just don't know. But this, at least the rhetoric has promised a very early resumption of girls' secondary education. We just don't know. So I mean, some change, but not a lot. With regard to the higher education, universities, the public universities haven't resumed, but the private universities have resumed teaching to men and women, but in a completely separated environment. They mandated all private universities to separate girls, women and men, women and men in classes. And if the number of women are fewer in a class, it doesn't merit having their own class. It should be separated with some sort of barriers. And generally, female faculty should be teaching female students. Except if there is no female faculty, like exceptional circumstances, then an older men of good reputation should be teaching the female faculty, and vice versa. So I mean, they are putting on restrictions, but they allow, at least for private universities, to continue. Public universities, I think the rules are not finalized yet, so they haven't resumed teaching yet. So it's just a very complex picture. It's very complicated. There are some hints that Taliban understand that Afghanistan has changed, and they may have to be more accommodating for the women roles in education, in workspace. However, they have put a lot of limitations in place, like there's a cap on the leadership roles, but also in education and other work areas. They are trying to work out how restrictive the rules should be, how separation should be implemented. And they are still working on those rules. We don't know what they are. And women's rights to work and receive education are dependent, is postponed until such a time when Taliban come up with those rules. And in light of those rules, we'll see how those issues are going to be resolved. It is, again, I think that they fundamentally believe the same thing about women they did in the 90s. But in terms of implementations of those beliefs, they appreciate, I think, that the world has changed. I mean, this is a different international context. And if they have any hope for international recognition and being part of the international community, they may have to, in implementation of their views, may be more accommodating. And also, they have realized that Afghan women have changed. As you know, there've been a lot of protests on the street led by Afghan women for their rights, basically into the streets and challenging the Taliban rule, resisting the Taliban, which signals to the Taliban that they may have to be much more cautious in implementing some of their views to just make sure that they can actually govern Afghanistan. And they've signaled that they appreciate that, although they are basically conditioning everything on restrictive rules that are not finalized yet, and we don't know them, the details of them. We just have to wait and see.
Thank you, sir. We hope that Taliban government will follow on through its promises by not undermining the women's right. So the next question is that, again, I am quoting President Biden. He recently made a statement that the idea we can deal with the rights of women all over the world by military force is not rational. What are your thoughts on Joe Biden's statement?
I mean, so the United States invasion of Afghanistan and then following all the efforts that occurred had a mixed effect on the Afghan society. On the one hand, it created the space where women were able to go to school. I mean, millions of girls started going to school. 40% of the children in school in Afghanistan are actually women. And it was made possible through the removal of the Taliban regime by force, and subsequently through investments that were made, like funding that were made available to the education sector in Afghanistan. So that's a positive thing. And there was Afghanistan had through the invasion and all the investment that came with it, Afghanistan developed a civil society space where women came to be cognizant of their rights, organize, form organizations for work for their rights and such, right? I mean, so that was one impact of it, one impact of invasion and the subsequent investment that were made in service of that invasion, the government that was put in place, and all other development works that were done. The other aspect of the U.S. invasion was actually absolutely the brutality of it. Civilian casualties, targeting of the orderly Afghans, bombing of Afghan, like droning the Afghanistan countryside, fighting the insurgency through heavy-handed military approach in the countryside of Afghanistan, with huge humanitarian costs to destruction of lives and such. So it is a mixed bag, and different Afghans were impacted differently with the U.S. invasion and through U.S. invasions. The gains, whatever gains might have been, was not distributed equally. I mean, and the cost, the loss, and the cost was not distributed equally either. So there were some Afghans in certain parts of the countries that bore most of the cost, because the war on terror and then the war on insurgency war was mostly fought in rural Afghanistan, especially in the Pashtun areas of the countries, whereas some of the gains remain concentrated in major urban centers. So that is true. Although it doesn't, I think there's the issue of urban and rural divide gets blown out of proportion. I think it's more matter of context of war. I mean, where there was more fighting and more violence, and where there was less violence and less fighting. It's more about that rather than being about fundamental views about rights and cultural attitudes that some people tend to exaggerate. Afghans everywhere would like to be left alone in terms of how they live their lives. They would like to have their opportunities, men and women, in terms of receiving an education and making a living for themselves. I don't think that's limited to urban centers. Those issues are not urban issues. Those are human issues. However, in a context of a war, rural Afghanistan was burning through the U.S. actions, and because of the U.S. actions and the Afghanistan-backed U.S.-backed Afghanistan government's action, Afghanistan countryside were burning. So therefore, in countryside of the country, especially in Pashtun areas, people had different priorities. They prioritized, obviously, the end of the war, the peace, over some of the other demands that people in urban areas may have had a priority, like women's rights and such. So in terms of whether the United States was trying to implement women's rights in Afghanistan through the barrel of the gun, I think that's the oversimplification of what occurred in Afghanistan. The United States did many things in Afghanistan and had a mixed impact on the Afghan society. It created space for women to go to school, receive an education, health of Afghan mothers have improved. It also empowered a government that was corrupt and predatory towards its population. And it also, the United States conducted a brutal war on Afghan soil, especially countryside of the country, and the Afghan government that was backed by the United States also conducted a brutal war in Afghan countryside that destroyed many lives. And obviously, people's perception of these past 20 years people's experiences of the past 20 years are very diverse. And for too many, I imagine, the United States is known for its violence, to its drone war, night raids, and just killing civilians and children. I mean, recently, like the last attack the United States conducted on Afghan soil was a drone strike that killed a family. Many children, 6 children were killed. I mean, that is just a metaphor for how, I mean, the war was conducted. It was not just that like that at the end. It was like that throughout. I think many in Afghanistan may have experienced U.S. occupation through that lens. That's what they understand of U.S. occupation, and that's what they understand of U.S. standing for. Like, that's what they believe U.S. was doing in Afghanistan. But others may have different perception of and different experiences of the U.S. occupation. So I say it's it's simplification. It's not necessarily what occurred, but obviously the issues of the gains of the past 20 years with regard to women's rights, regard to democracy and such, were tainted, to say the least, were tainted with all the horrible things the United States and the US-backed government in Afghanistan did, with regard to civilian casualties, mistreatment of the population, the predatory behavior, and such. So it is reasonable to say that to a large part of the country, possibly some of those gains were tainted, were people had formed judgment about everything the United States done based on those track record of the horrible things that the United States has also done. And Afghan population the experience was divided, and that's why the experience of the war and peace, now the Taliban are in power, there is a de facto decrease in violence, like major decrease in violence. The experience obviously is different, but I wouldn't simplify that point. I think it's a much more complex picture.
Thank you, sir. So our audience have a common question that how Taliban is going to regulate the judiciary in Afghanistan, and how will they uphold the rights of citizens of Afghanistan? Could you please tell us this in a brief way?
Right. So, as I said, when they announced a caretaker government, they did not announce they made no announcement about the judiciary, neither the structure of the judiciary, nor the people who are going to be heading the Supreme Court of Afghanistan, the highest court in the land. It tells me that it's not a very high priority at the moment for them. In practice, they do arrest people, they do punish people, but without adjudication. I'm sure in social media you might have seen certain people being punished on the streets in different cities of Afghanistan, and it's basically on the spot punishment by not through a trial, a court system, but through what you could call a kangaroo court or whatever, just the people on the spot, the people who arrest them, asking questions, and then executing a punishment. That's been the approach so far. The courts are not functioning that much. The quote-unquote police force, that basically Taliban fighters, are acting as the judge, judiciary, as the judge, jury, and executioner, basically. How it's going to change over time, I don't know. They're going to have to at some point set up a court system and think about possibly a prosecution department, even though Taliban never had a prosecution department, and they still don't appreciate the due process that calls for prosecution and kind of the adversarial process of defense and prosecution in order to prosecute and punish a person through due process. They don't have that much appreciation for it. They believe in a more rough brand of justice, and they believe in displaying that kind of force as a way of controlling the society. I think it is one of the reasons they may be able to scare, certain bad actors and deter them from engaging in illegal behavior. But at the same time, they're going to create a general sense of unease and insecurity. Because as you know, people don't need to only be protected against thieves; they also must feel like they are protected against the government abuses, right? And the whole idea of due process and the judiciary and all the systems of law we have in place is partly to make sure that people feel safe against the state intrusion, right? You feel like if you're accused of something, there's a process through which you would have a fair chance to make your case, basically present arguments and evidence in your support to prove that you were possibly you were innocent. That is that's an important part of people feeling safe in a society, not just against thieves, but also against state violence. With regard to dispute resolution as well, people would like to know that the process is a very considered process. If there is a case brought against them, that just after asking a few questions, a person, based on their personal judgment, would not decide on their matters of their property and such. So, I think for the Afghan society to be able to function as a healthy society, and we need a legal system to be set up. We need all this. In any case where a person is punished, a person's rights are affected, there needs to be a due process in place, and there should be a functioning legal system. But Taliban don't seem to prioritize that at the moment. They believe in a rough brand of justice, and they often, what they've implemented so far is basically on-the-spot punishment. And with regard to dispute resolution, private dispute resolution as well, the Taliban fighters, like commanders, local commanders, often act as judge, and they basically listen to different parties, and they just dispense decisions, and they enforce them on the spot. That's been the operation so far. How it's going to change, I don't know. I hope they appreciate the importance of setting up a legal system and in due process and all of that. The indications are they may not appreciate it as much. We'll just have to see. You're muted still. Sorry.
Thank you, sir. I hope that our audience would have got their answers. To conclude all what we have discussed, what are your remarks on this power transfer, and what role the UN and other countries have in this process?
I think Afghanistan is facing a huge humanitarian catastrophe. 95% of the population may fall below poverty line. The hunger is a serious issue. Afghanistan is going through a drought as well. Afghanistan health sector is crumbling. So the health of women, Afghanistan mothers, I mean, every 2 hours, a woman dies in Afghanistan giving birth. Afghanistan health care system was completely dependent on foreign aid. The World Bank was funding Afghanistan healthcare system through Sehat Mandi project. It's a World Bank project. So, I mean, there's a huge humanitarian catastrophe. Hunger, health, basic Afghan needs are not being met. And there has to be an immediate humanitarian relief operation. And many countries having complicated relationship with the Taliban, not recognizing the Taliban, has made it very difficult for the aid delivery to actually take place. The United Nations has an important role to play here, to be the conduit through which help and aid receives Afghans, and the issues of aid is decoupled from the issue of the politics of recognition of the Taliban. It's an important role the UN should play. They signal that they would like to play that role, but so far they have started working on it, and they've received a pledge of up to $1 billion from different countries in helping avoid the humanitarian catastrophe in Afghanistan. And they would have to build up their reputation, their operation in Afghanistan. They would have to put in the actual delivery system in place, make sure it's transparent, make sure it gets to the right people, and all of those things. They're working on it, but the process is slow. It has to speed up. The humanitarian catastrophe in Afghanistan is imminent, and UN has a huge role to play in terms of being the conduit through which aid receives Afghans, and the basic aid delivery in Afghanistan is not impacted by the politics of recognition of the Taliban or the possible different complicated relationship different countries have with the Taliban government now in power. So that's a very important role that the UN had, and I hope they can actually live up to this moment and actually deliver aid to Afghans in these hard times. There've been signals and indications. The United Nations Secretary General have said basically that they see that as their role. But also UN has said that they cannot solve all Afghan problems, and there is a need for international community to work together to solve the issues of Afghanistan. I also appreciate that. There is need to be an engagement with Taliban. Taliban are the de facto government. The world should choose to engage with the Taliban, incentivize them, pressure them, engage with them to respect the basic rights of the citizens, and also to maintain the necessary conditions for the investment to take place, because aid is basically a band-aid. It's just people don't die. But in order to recover Afghan economy, make sure that Afghans can make a living, get jobs, and just basically Afghanistan to have an economy, there needs to be investment in infrastructure, water management, electricity. Afghanistan imports 70% of its electricity from other countries. And without foreign money, it doesn't have a lot of domestic resources to pay for those important energy. So I mean, to rebuild the Afghan economy, there needs to be investment beyond just aid. And for those investments to take place, there must be engagement with the Taliban. There must be different understanding reached between different stakeholders with the Taliban as to what it takes from the Taliban to make those investments possible. And all of that requires engagement, dialogue, and pressuring, incentivizing, and engagements to continue. Isolation was tried. Taliban were isolated. They became a pariah in the 90s. I hope they've taken the lesson from that they need to engage, they need to be pragmatic, they need to actually deliver on the promises they made to the Afghans with regard to better lives, and to the international community with regard to counterterrorism. And I think the world should help engage with them, should help them achieve those goals, and also pressure and incentivize them to avoid some of their policies, social and gender policies, that would be both bad for the Afghan economy, Afghan society, but also bad for them in terms of ensuring they receive international recognition and can receive the funds they need to recover Afghan economy.
Thank you, sir. All right, with this, we come to the end of our episode, and we would like to express our gratitude to Dr. Haroun Rahimi for sharing his knowledge and intellect with us and our viewers. Sir, we hope to see you in future again. Thank you so much for joining us.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. Take care.
Our next episode will be broadcasted in October, and soon we will be starting an interdisciplinary lecture series, and more about the same will be uploaded on our social media. So please subscribe our channel and social media pages to get the updates. Do join us for the upcoming lectures and web dialogue to collect insight and to enlighten yourself. Thank you so much for joining us.